Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with two wonderful scholars of the life and thought of Thomas More about a new volume they've edited called The Essential Works of Thomas More. We're visited today by Gerard Wegemer of the University of Dallas and Stephen Smith of Hillsdale College. I'll introduce to you first Gerard Wegemer. He is professor of English and director of the Center for Thomas More Studies at the University of Dallas. He is the author, by my count, of at least 6 books on Thomas More and a number of other essays and reviews on this thinker. And he has taught at the University of Dallas for a number of years. Gerard, we're glad to have you. Next, Stephen Smith, who is Dean of the Faculty in the Temple Family Chair in English Literature at Hillsdale College, along with being the co-editor with Gerard of The Essential Works of Thomas More. He's also the author of The Fire of Life, Wonder and Education, and Late Shakespeare. Welcome, gentlemen, both of you.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So thinking about this book, The Essential Works of Thomas More, many of our listeners will know Thomas More through a man for all seasons, which many say is an incomplete account or maybe not actually true account of Thomas More, but one very entertaining and dramatic. Sketch for us, Gerard, who was Thomas More?
Well, Thomas More is most famous for the Utopia and for holding the highest office in England under Henry VIII. He was a poet, philosopher, historian, lawyer, judge, and a statesman who died for the rule of law and conscience and the proper autonomy of church and state. He was also, in Chesterton's view, a turning point in the history of liberty.
Talk about that.
Well, More understood as a lawyer and a judge, and a very experienced lawyer and judge, that liberty was justice through the rule of law ordered towards the good of the people. He, as a young man, learned Greek so he could understand these issues of jurisprudence from Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Augustine and Aquinas. He studied these in the original language so he could understand all the elements in the complexity of achieving some measure of justice in an imperfect world.
I want to come back to that later, particularly his humanist learning and his scholarship in that regard. This volume is absolutely enormous. And as I was saying to both of you before we started, I thought I understood Thomas More fairly well. I realized there's a lot that I don't, that I need to learn. Stephen, what does this volume reveal to us about the thought of Thomas More?
Well, I share your experience of the book as one of the makers of it with Jerry. I mean, I think I could speak for both of us in saying that the labor of making this, of bringing this book into published form, challenged us at every turn. That More was kind of more comprehensive, more challenging, addressed more subjects, and wrote in more forms than we. It's hard to put into words what the experience of making a book like this is. But a reader encountering it, would encounter, the versatile and challenging and comprehensive wit of this genius, Thomas More. The book has all of his essential Latin and English writings. He wrote in both Latin and English. It has both his poetry and his prose. A lot of people don't know that More wrote poetry and wrote at a very high level. It has as many of his letters as we could fit in it. It has complete chronologies and timelines, appendices giving the earliest biographical writings on More from the 16th century. And really, if listeners out there want to get a kind of turbo and great view of the book, they should just go to www.essentialmore.org, the supporting website, which is a beautiful supporting website and probably the best introduction to the book that I could recommend. But really, when we made the book, Richard, what we were doing was aiming at a single service, providing the readers with everything they need to encounter and study the comprehensive Thomas More. And I think your experience of More is like many, which is we know of him through Man for All Seasons. We know something of the historic and legal drama. But my goodness, look at all these writings to the tune of 1,500 double column pages in all these different forms on literature, on philosophy, on law, on theology, poetry. It's extraordinary achievement. And he's the first major writer of the English Renaissance. And we want everyone to know that.
Thinking more specifically, I want to come to you, Jerry, on just the legal question that Thomas More confronted, and indeed much greater than a legal question, I think probably a regime question. What specifically is he confronted with, and what does he do in response, just for the clarity of our listeners?
Well, that's where the entire career of More is important and necessary, to see how even as a young man, he's grappling with the issues that deeply affect the life of peace and justice in England. So England is just come out of a civil war when More is 7 years old. They're threatened to go into another civil war periodically.
Would this have been the War of the Roses?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. In fact, he will write a history of Richard III, which is about the end of that tremendous war.
Okay.
And so he's immersed as a historian in the cultural and historical issues that face every leader of government. And this is where he feels himself inadequate as a young man and goes back to study the classics and to study medieval history and to study law. He lectures on law twice at 2 different law schools before he becomes a judge and a lawyer for the City of London, and then eventually, under certain conditions, accepts, after a conversation about conscience with Henry VIII, to be an advisor to him, which he does very successfully for 12 years until tensions arise about constitutional issues of church and state.
So you're saying because of the tumult he experienced in England as a young man, this drives him into scholarship. This drives him into humanist learning.
Yes. He's a person who deeply is immersed in the life of London, but he's also immersed in the best way as an intellectual in the fundamental issues that any lawyer or judge has to deal with. It's why in our tradition, lawyers and judges have received the highest and best education available in each of their countries, because justice is a very fraught issue with dangers and limitations and requires extraordinary prudence to know, well, what can we do under these actual circumstances?
Thinking about, just for a minute, More is confronted with Henry VIII, who declares himself head of the Church of England, which he reforms, reshapes according to his will, and More must give his assent to that. And he refuses to, and therefore is executed. Is that sort of a simple understanding of what's happened?
Yes. And along the way, clear manipulation of Parliament under Cromwell's strategic genius, but also manipulation of convocation, the church's legislative bodies. Few people remember that Warham, who's the head of the church, completely dissociates himself publicly and confronts Henry VIII in Parliament from everything that they passed under his pressure. Henry visits Parliament personally 3 times and asks for a division of the House, so he knows who's on his side and who's not. And Cromwell is going to fashion a Parliament that is going to do the will of himself and the king. That's why More, in his trial and the execution, prays that God give Henry good counsel and refers to the Parliament such as it is.
Thinking about this time in England, there isn't much resistance, from my understanding. Thomas More, there's a bishop, John Fisher. Those are the only ones that I can find. Is this just sort of the natural human tendency towards weakness in the face of overwhelming power and fear for one's own security and future? Or is there a lot of other things going on at this time to sort of help us make sense of what's going on?
Well, that's where there's a lot of research that has yet to be done and records that need to be looked at again. What you recounted is the usual story, but there was considerable resistance, and there was an anticipation that what was promised would actually be fulfilled. But this is where More's life is a drama.
Okay.
And this is where Chesterton would talk about Moore as being a turning point in the history of liberty. Liberty is very hard to achieve, and it requires citizens who are educated and prepared, not just intellectually, but also as citizens equipped to confront the difficulties that people who want to achieve power and money at any price will always exert. There are certain perennial issues in everyone's life.
Mm. Stephen, just sort of switching gears here, you noted the collection of poetry in the volume earlier. What does the poetry reveal about More's mind and sort of what he loves and presents in the poetry?
Well, as I mentioned before, most people don't think of Moore as a poet, but not only was he a poet, but was sometimes scoffingly referred to one. But his poetry is in English and in Latin. And Dr. Samuel Johnson, who did that great dictionary of the English language, he gave a large sample of Thomas More's works, his poetry, and some of his other writings because they were considered models of pure and elegant style. So he was known for his eloquence. And in the poetry in particular, he wrote a poem called The Pageant of Life, which imagines human life from birth to eternity. And he wrote poems on fortune and poverty. Late in the Tower of London, he wrote a poem called Lewis, the Lost Lover, which is a little ditty about this guy, Lewis, who rejects eye-flattering fortune when it comes to him, offering him help. So he has all of these really wonderful English poems, but perhaps of the most interest and the least well-known, his Latin poetry, his epigrams. Two great critics of these poems wrote that they display More's logical energy, muscular realism, and penetrating intelligence. And these Latin poems were paired and published with Utopia. And so when you go and pick up a copy of Utopia in the bookstore, the library, you don't ever see all of these Latin poems with it. And one of the things we hope to do eventually is to put an edition out that puts them back together again, because the Latin poetry really sheds light on Utopia in a number of startling ways. But just to give you a sense of what the Latin poetry addresses, it addresses human friendship, it addresses comedy, but a lot of the poetry on political life and political philosophy is maybe the most interesting. He has a poem called "What's the Best Form of Government?" Is it rule by one or rule by a senate? He has a poem entitled "The Consent of the People Both Bestows and Withdraws Sovereignty." He has poems about good kings, poems about tyranny. And so this poetry is an important part of his legacy that's really not well known and not studied enough. And these epigrams in particular show as much of his mind as anything he wrote. His humor as well. Like one of my favorite ones is kind of silly, but it's just a short poem that goes like this. If an untrimmed beard makes a philosopher, why could not a bearded goat be a Plato? Question mark. So this is the humor of Moore is very, we're so serious, right? With Henry VIII and tyranny and decapitation.
Yeah.
But this is a soul who is famous for his good humor and his good cheer and his wit. And it comes out in this poetry as well.
It seems, just as I read the poetry, he seemed to be concerned with the end state of man and with sort of a robust soul in approaching the problems of life, the difficulties of life. It, in my mind, helped me understand sort of the type of soul he was in the largest question he would confront at the end of his life.
Well, I think he's searching for a perspective on human life. For that pageant of life,
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest things to come by is a reliable and clear and trustworthy perspective on our human drama. We so often lose that altogether and can't see it all. That's why in the history of Richard III, More cries out against the blindness of our human nature.
Yeah. Thinking just along these lines about human nature, how did his thinking about human nature sort of shape what he thought about politics? Do we have him preferring, from the Utopia, a Republican form of government and sort of a begrudging acceptance of monarchy? That makes him a very interesting thinker within England, to say the least.
Well, that poem, What is the Best Form of Government? It does contrast sure counsel with blind fortune when comparing an elected Senate and a hereditary monarch. In a similar way, Utopia introduces to England the vocabulary of Cicero in terms of the elements of republican self-government. This is a dimension that is rarely referred to in that important book. Now, on the other hand, More is extraordinarily discreet. After all, the chief spokesman in Utopia is called Raphael Hypsipylos, speaker of nonsense. More is not proposing any of this. It's Raphael who's pointing out all the serious difficulties of hereditary monarchy and also the poverty that occurs when you don't think about the good of the people. More never uses the word subject in his literary writings. It's always citizens and the people. He has a deep, deep assessment of England's whole history. So in Richard III, for instance, he points out in the Latin edition that it's Parliament that has the absolute political authority in England, not the king.
Yeah.
Now, he doesn't say not the king. But More is clearly writing for ages, and part of the way of overcoming poverty and civil war is to have more mature and robust political institutions. More is the first person to write a speech in Parliament as Speaker of the House, defending the need for free speech. And he makes this address to Henry himself. And in the 1523 Parliament, Henry grants free speech because of More, although he will never do it again.
So More, as a young man, confronts the King of England and was briefly thrown into jail, isn't he?
This is where More goes back to the sources. He even writes in his letter to Oxford and in some of his humanist writings that it's necessary to learn these original languages because translations are so inadequate. And these are complex issues, and we need subtle writers and subtle minds. Another aspect of his poetry is that you see, even from his teens, how serious, committed he is to improving his writing and his thinking. Over 100 of his 300 poems are translations and imitations of Greek poems. He's trying to understand from within the many arts that a lawyer and a judge need, and one of them is the art of language and being able to speak to a people in a way that is persuasive and moving to that particular group of people.
Talk about, Stephen, if you would. I just want to switch gears here for a minute because I want to keep uncovering. I want to keep this legal track, law track, but also with the humanist track. Thomas More and Erasmus, their friendship, and what does it mean?
This is an incredible relationship that lasted much of More's professional life. And we actually have a letter that survives from Erasmus that describes his friend Thomas More in detail. And it's one of the best introductions you could have, I think, to Thomas More and to Erasmus and to what they valued as humanists. I won't get bogged down in all the details of the letter, but one of the famous things Erasmus says is that Thomas More was born for friendship, and that if you needed a perfect example of friendship in action, you could see it in More. And so that letter identifies so many things that are important to More, but it's friendship that is the emphasis there. And both, Erasmus's Adages begins with friends share all things in common. And in general, the subject of human friendship is at the heart of More's project. That the human being needs friends. He has epigrams about this. A statesman exercises something like civic friendship. There should be civic friendship between citizens, but that emphasis on friendship is crystal clear, and it's really the key to this relationship. After More died, there's a beautiful line from Erasmus where he says, in August, More died in July, so in August, Erasmus wrote someone and said, "When More died, I seemed to have died myself. We were a single soul." And so this close relationship between these two great humanists. But the key thing, I think, for us is their common commitment to an understanding of friendship. And for listeners, some of the great sources on friendship that More knew and that we can return to ourselves, Aristotle's Ethics, Cicero on friendship. There are scriptural texts on friendship. Aquinas has written on friendship. It's one of the most important parts of his legacy. So he was, a man for all seasons. He has these different titles, but I really like that, born for friendship. I'm sure Jerry has more to say about Erasmus.
Yeah, please do, Jerry.
One of the things we included in this book was the play written in Queen Elizabeth's time called Sir Thomas More. And it's by 5 different playwrights. We have 5 different hands in which we have the manuscript. Of course, it was never performed. But the first time that More is introduced in this play to Erasmus, the noble and poet Surrey says this about More: "This little island holds not a truer friend unto the arts, nor doth his greatness add a feigned flourish to his worthy parts. He's great in study, that's the statesman's grace, that gains more reverence than the outward place. That study is the general watch of England. In it, the prince's safety and the peace that shines upon our commonwealth are forged by loyal industry." Now, the words that the playwright uses are fascinating. Friend, statesman, study as a way of achieving commonwealth, the common good, and peace. But it's forged by loyal industry. Now, that's another term that is associated by anyone who knows More well, and it's part of his mystery. Here is a genius who works harder than anybody else.
Yeah. Thinking about humanism, we keep using that term. The recovery of humanism the humanists are about study classical literature, philosophy, politics, poetry, to the displacement or ignoring sort of the Christian contribution and Christian tradition. But that wasn't More and Erasmus. How did they understand their humanism?
Well, they shared that common Renaissance spirit of wanting to return to the sources, to those great sources of wisdom in Latin and Greek writings. But they certainly didn't see those as, or didn't sort of put their Christianity aside when they did so. But I think so you can look at 2 ways. You can look at the integration that they achieved between Christianity and the best of classical wisdom. You can also look at it in terms of that spirit of going back to these key sources, ad fontes. And there's a famous letter that we include from More to Oxford University, in which he actually addresses secular learning on the one hand, the liberal arts, and theology on the other. And he says in this letter to Oxford University, which I would put on the short list for listeners to look up, he says, "Secular learning prepares the soul for virtue, and it fosters prudence in human affairs," a thing that's not useless to theologians.
No, that's very true.
And so I thought that, to me, is a real important sentence that, they understood learning as having this preparatory role, preparing the soul for virtue, and then in particular, histories and literature fostering prudence in human affairs. And so it's not so much an either or in terms of classical Christian with humanism, but a both and that's the one sentence that comes to mind from that letter to Oxford University.
Another letter to put on the short list is the letter to Gunnell. That's the tutor to More's children. And in that, he insists that it's important to put virtue in the first place and learning in the second. Now, he had a daughter who was a genius like himself, but he clearly understood Aristotle's point that as a person is, so does the person judge. Character makes an enormous difference on what you see, and if you're able to see what is actually there. And this is where harmony that was traditionally understood between the classical and the Christian became so important for More and Erasmus. When Erasmus goes to England, there he's actually convinced by More in the circle to take up and master Greek himself. And he will spend the next several years doing that. And that's where More challenges him to this Greek translating contest. And More chooses a classical author that's not usually on people's short list, the comic philosopher Lucian. But More tells us why he chooses Lucian. And he says that Lucian has this capacity, because of his humor, to probe more deeply than anyone else without upsetting the reader's equanimity, calmness of soul. Lucian can get people to think without stirring up those emotions that impede thinking. Now, this is a worldly wisdom that can be lost. But this is what Erasmus and More were trying to recapture. This is the fullness of human life in which there is no opposition between the best of nature and of revelation.
And how would he have related revelation and nature to one another, Thomas More?
I think most by his example.
Okay.
As a young man, he quotes this throughout his life, the biblical passage that God loves a cheerful giver. And this explains, for instance, where even what scandalizes people at his death is what the English historian Hall says that More mocks at his own death, making jokes on the scaffold and on his way up. How could a person mock at his own death? Well, God loves a cheerful giver. And we see this more at the very end.
Yeah. So he would understand himself. He is giving his life for the truth, and he should do so cheerfully.
Well, and also for the country. That here again, he gives his life for the rule of law and liberty and the common good. You actually have an example of an extraordinarily free person, even in prison, even going to his death. I mean, this is what makes his death so shocking to those who are trying to intimidate and to bend him to their will. They had no power over this person. Here was a person with true liberty.
True freedom. Talk about the theme then of tyranny in Thomas More's writings. Either one of you, or maybe we'll start with Jerry and then move with you, Stephen.
Well, it's surprising that More's very first published work, which no one knows about, this is why we wanted to do the full span of More's writings, is on the nature of tyranny and the grave problems that a republic faces when a tyrant takes over. That is included in his book of translations on Lucian, because he proposes to Erasmus. They both address this topic. And then, of course, his most famous work on tyranny is Richard III, but he has at least 10 poems on this topic, which he appends to the Utopia. So this is and of course, Richard III is the work that profoundly influences Shakespeare, and Shakespeare bases his first 4 plays on More's Richard III.
So, Stephen, you thinking about your thoughts on tyranny in More's writings and what he thinks is the depth of tyranny?
You know, in that letter I mentioned that Erasmus wrote on Thomas More, he not only said he was born for friendship, but he told us what his friend kind of loved and hated. And he loved equality, actually, and he hated tyranny in particular. And so one of the things that comes out of that letter is not just born for friendship, but this particular interest in tyranny. And, you know, to Jared's point about his first published writing being on tyrannicide, and then the history of Richard III, addressing Richard's rise, how it happened, how England failed to prevent his tyranny, and then the poem on it. You know, what you have is kind of glimpse into something that's at the core of More's understanding of this is a possibility in politics. And if we're going to be educating citizens or educating leaders, we need them to understand this phenomenon, understand this possibility. How does a tyrant come into being? What is a tyrant? And then, of course, why do cultures fail to resist them? How do they take root? How do they maintain themselves? How do they succeed? And, you know, in this interest in tyranny links more back to, of course, earlier thinkers like Cicero and Aristotle and Plato on the subject. And so much of his early writing is revealing and educating on this crucial subject. One of the poems, for example, says, it's kind of a funny poem about death and tyrants. More presents death as kind of the only tyrannicide when you really get down to it. The tyrants can't live forever. Shucks. Mm-hmm. And so death ends up conquering them. But then Richard III, you know, this spectacular, incredible English and Latin text on Richard's rise. You know, why did England fail? I mean, and they were, of course, dominated by fear. The narrator points out several times. They also didn't have enough wit to resist tyranny, and they didn't understand what a tyrant was willing to do to secure his rule. So it's a powerful text. And Jared mentioned the Shakespeare connection as well. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare's breakthrough tragedy is History of Richard III, and More is his major source. So I like to think of the young Shakespeare, who is so keenly interested in England, so much aware of the problem with civil war in that country and culture. And I imagine that young man, that young brilliant dramatist, sitting at the foot of Thomas More and reading his history. Yeah. And wow, the things that happen in that play and afterwards in Shakespeare are legendary. I think he's his best student, frankly.
Oh, and tyranny also has a personal dimension. So yes, we all understand political tyranny, but many of More's epigrams and poems show how ridiculous each person is by being a tyrant to those around them. We all can be tyrants. And this is where, again, More's comprehensiveness as a thinker, that you need citizen education if you're going to have a free country. You need human beings who aren't slaves to their own passions or slaves to ideologies that they haven't thought about and made their own and refined through conversation with good friends. So the tyranny issue, one of the most important themes in classical literature, Xenophon's famous book on tyranny. One couldn't be a liberally educated person unless one understood the perennial possibility of tyranny in a country and tyranny in oneself.
So that should lead us to shudder then about our own country's fate, given the overall lack of civic education and the overall lack of awareness of how passions destroy freedom and how ideologies destroy freedom. Thinking here, Brad Burzer recently said on Law and Liberty that those who love the liberal arts the most suffer the most, and he referenced several figures, Socrates, Cicero, but also Thomas More. And as I'm listening to you two gentlemen describe his thought and his humanism, it's almost as if were he not to have done what he did with regard to Henry VIII, he would have repudiated his entire life and what he had been about.
One thing, again, More is convinced that there is such a thing as providence. And this is one reason why one has to reflect on his own calm of mind, even in the tower. And also on the short list of things to read, to get to know More as More, would be his two tower writings. One is the Dialogue on Comfort, and it is a Socratic dialogue which deals with how to overcome a passion that's taken control of the soul. And the passion, of course, is fear at this point. And it's an in-depth study of how difficult it is to rule oneself. It's a conversation between an old person on his deathbed who's gone through terrors throughout his life and a young person who's just about to face the worst terrors possible and imaginable, who's overcome by fears of what's going to happen. We wouldn't have that conversation. We wouldn't have that book before we got imprisoned. And the second is his Sadness of Christ, which is his last work. And it's probably the most accessible work. It's short. He has to write it in a hurry. He knows he only has a few weeks to live. But it gives his last lessons on what one must do to be a free person.
Which is?
Understand your soul and have a good friend to help you see your own self-contradictions. Also, to form what he calls a right imagination, not one dominated by fears and false imaginings. It actually shows the importance of Socratic conversation. That is, Socrates is most famous for raising questions about the nature of virtue and getting people to come to know themselves, at least in a beginning way. Self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. But you can't really know yourself unless you've been put in dire situations you don't expect, and you might be surprised at how fearful or imprudent or rash or cowardly you can actually be. But once you know that, well, then this is where one becomes open to put virtue in the first place and learning in the second. And this is part of the interest of More's writings on education. But the masterpiece is going to be his Dialogue on Comfort. It's a book longer than The Republic, but it is a book that is designed to reveal the nature of the soul and how one can train oneself to overcome fears. Now, it's interesting. If you read the prison letters, More confesses to his daughter that he'd always considered himself a fearful person. Now, that's not the persona anyone sees, but he had to overcome that. He says in one of his letters that he scandalizes himself before being imprisoned about his fear.
Yeah. Thinking about More, though, I mean, his conscience, he would have had clearly this conception of conscience being a window of his soul that God spoke to. I've read both of those that you reference, and clear to me that his courage, conviction, strength comes through his belief that he's participating in God's will.
No, and that's very well put. And this is where the playwrights are so perceptive by singling out More's commitment to study, finding out the truth, and then habituating oneself to live in the truth. More does talk about the duty of integrity and the duty of protecting one's integrity, of the harmony between what one says and thinks and what one does. And that is the greatest challenge to every human being.
Yeah. Did More ever comment on sort of the overall political condition of England at this time as he reflected on what had happened and how it had come to pass that, basically something like this complete change in its laws and constitution was worked by the king, Henry VIII?
Well, Stephen can comment on this also, but two elements that come right to mind for me is his comment just before going into the Tower in his last work he's writing on before going to the Tower, of where institutionally kings have changed the process of selecting bishops, where they have done it sometimes for pleasure, sometimes for favor, and sometimes for money too. And institutionally, this is the great problem that England faced. Half of the House of Lords were abbots and bishops, whose work often was more for the king than for any spiritual project. And so more clearly identifies that as an institutional problem. Yeah. But no surprise. Becket, the long centuries controversy of what the church-state role is going to be in terms of what are actually tremendously powerful cultural forces. Emperors wanted the church on their side because the church serves the people, and good people in the church know the people. That's one. And the second was that the bishops themselves, that's on the side of the state, the bishops themselves did not reform themselves. Yeah. That they had the laws on the books. They knew what they should do, but they didn't do it.
Yeah. Stephen, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that, on that last point, in the sadness of Christ, and this is a nice link between sadness of Christ and utopia, More describes how there is a shameful ship's captain, a cowardly captain, who relinquishes the ship in the storm and hides away in some cranny in the ship's hold, and just sort of consigns the ship to the waves. And that does seem to be a critique like you're suggesting, Jer, where it's like in the history of Richard III as well, that we can never underestimate the failure of will. I mean, of sheer fortitude and courage. And in that famous passage of Sadness of Christ, which links back to this text in Utopia about never giving up the ship in a storm, there was a storm of the first order in these years. And I think what More indicates in that last writing is many gave up the ship in the storm and hid away in the ship's hold out of fear, out of a desire to preserve their life, a sense of their own benefit, any number of motives like that. But it was really a failure of captains.
Yeah. What becomes of Thomas More's place in English life after this? How is he regarded? I mean, he loses, and of course England will become a Protestant empire after that. But is there sort of a look back within English intellectual life at his greatness, or is he sort of, or they don't know what to do with him?
Well, he's very good at inspiring wonder in onlookers. Yeah. Jerry mentioned the historian Hall, who says, I don't know whether to call him a wise foolish man or a foolish wise man when I consider how he went to his death. And so in the 16th century, at least, you have sort of mixed verdict, but there does seem to be an admiration, even wonder over his wit, and then either happiness that he stood with the church, or a lament, like, well, in that matter, he just did his, he just went the wrong way, depending on the historian or the writer. But I mean, that capacity to inspire wonder in people is really, I think, at the heart of Thomas More. You know, who was he? How did he prepare himself and educate himself? How did he play the part he played on the English stage unto death? It's really kind of wonder inspiring, and it makes you want to learn and to study him. Later in the 16th century, he's still known in London as the best friend that the poor ever had, for example. And so, you have this whole kind of complicated legacy. But, I know one reason we wanted to put this book out there and to gather these works together and to make them available is to not only help people wonder over Thomas More again, but really to study him and to learn from his life and writings.
Jerry, your thoughts here?
Well, the 16th century play for Thomas More is completely favorable to Thomas More, and it's by 5 London playwrights who have completely different religious and political convictions. They're the most unusual group you would expect to be together. But even for The Man for All Seasons, when that came out in 66, it was immediately translated into 10 languages. It became part of the reading list for English prep schools for the next 20 years. This model of conscience is something the world needs. Yeah.
No, that's very true. Thinking maybe we can end with this, and you both take this on. Jerry, I'll start with you. Thomas More, because you started talking about at the beginning of our interview More in his regard for liberty under law. How did he approach the duties of being a lawyer?
Wit and good cheer. For 10 years, he was elected every year as undersheriff under 10 different sheriffs of London. And this meant that he was the presiding legal officer at the court of the Sheriff of London that heard all kinds of cases. And More becomes famous for befriending the city in being someone who would give a fair hearing to everyone and often remit the money and recommend that they not pursue this because it wouldn't work or that it would be less expensive not to go through the law courts. But he was seen as a person who would give honest counsel and who was genuinely committed to the good of the whole city. But that's where, again, you can see the benefits of his learning. He knew Cicero's on duties very, very well. And two of the principles that Cicero gives for justice is that you have to think in terms of the good of the whole of the body politic. You can't favor one part. This More understood clearly. And so his book called Utopia, the actual title in Latin is De Republicae Statu, Res Publica, Republic, Commonwealth, good of the people. That's the horizon people need in terms of thinking about justice. And that's where he's particularly important in our own time, where we have become so divisive and uncivil, and the lack of this sense of, look, we are all in this body politic together. Let's do the best we can together.
Yeah. Stephen, your thoughts on Thomas More as a lawyer?
Well, on that short list, reading the letter to Ganel, the one that's addressed to his children's teacher, he says, I prefer, virtue joined with learning to all the treasures of kings. But then he also says the whole fruit of learning is a right conscience, a kind of rightly working conscience. And I think that's really at the heart of his legal success, is that he indeed enjoyed the fruit of that particular fruit of learning, that he not only understood his education as forming his conscience to work rightly and to kind of serve almost like a lasting friend throughout the whole of life. And so he brought his education, his formation, his commitment to virtue, his right conscience into his work. And he had the courage to follow the judgments of conscience right to that scaffold. And so to me, Thomas More, the lawyer, Thomas More, the professional, it's really Thomas More, the man, and I would direct the attention to that conscience that is the whole fruit of learning, according to More. Like if you at the end of your education don't have a rightly functioning conscience, and if you haven't learned the need for the courage to follow it, it's like you've gained the whole world but gained nothing. So that right conscience is what really stands out in my mind in answer to your question. The lawyer is man of conscience.
And we see that in Moore's very last words when he says, "I die the king's good servant and God's first." When he said those words, he was reminding Henry VIII of the two most important conversations they ever had. And they were both about conscience. Before he agreed to work for him as a counselor, and before he agreed to become Lord Chancellor of England. And Henry said to him on both occasions, "Look first to God and your conscience, and then to your king." And this is where, for Moore, there's no conflict between good law and conscience. Probably the most famous line of Man for All Seasons, and the letter that Roper, his lawyer son-in-law, writes about Moore, is that he would give even the devil his right, his cause being good, and he would follow the law, because law is the work of good reason, and conscience is the judgment of good reason. And that's why you need lawyers and judges who actually do have a command of both, of the law and of the principles that undergird the law.
I think that's very well said, and I think that's a wonderful way for us to end. Gerard Wegemer and Stephen Smith, thank you so much for discussing this volume you've edited for Yale University Press, The Essential Works of Thomas More.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.